There came a moment when I realized that if I remained exactly where I was, I would eventually disappear into the image they had created for me. Everyone knew Marilyn Monroe, but almost no one knew the person behind her. I was tired of being manipulated by agents, the press, people close to me, contracts. Tired of parties where so many young models and actresses were treated as though they were part of the menu. I was tired of the manipulations and actions that diminished me as a woman, as a citizen, and as an actress. I was tired of the constant pressure from doctors and agents urging me to take more and more medication. It felt like a way of controlling me, but worse still, it was not happening only to me. It was happening to many other artists as well. I left. I left Los Angeles, broke with the powerful 20th Century Fox, and set off for New York. It was not an impulsive gesture. It was a conscious break from the machine that had transformed Norma Jean Mortensen into a global symbol, a person forbidden from expressing her own feelings. I, Marilyn, was already beginning to perceive something painful. The more the world saw a fantasy, the less it saw the woman. The amount of medication and the way everything was handled did not seem normal to me. It was difficult to believe in or trust the people around me, as they all said the same things. Medical reports were shown to me as though the only path forward was through increasingly high dosages. Joe DiMaggio was the only person with whom I felt safe discussing these matters, and he agreed with me. Together we began to devise a plan in which I would renew my entire team, doctors, lawyers, agents, everyone. I would be treated by a single reputable physician in New York. Going to New York was the beginning of this new opportunity. New York represented another possibility, another rhythm, another identity. There, I founded my own production company, Marilyn Monroe Productions, alongside my friend, the photographer and producer Milton Green. It was a bold move for any actor in the 1950s. For a woman, it was almost unthinkable. But in 1955, I did it. That was who I was. A woman ahead of her time, who refused to listen to misogynistic insults. A courageous, intelligent, fearless, and delicate woman. Not the fragile person they so cowardly described me as. I was human. Do you truly believe that the woman they describe as Marilyn Monroe would have created her own production company in 1955, practically in defiance of Hollywood and all its powerful figures? Think deeply and consciously. Marilyn Monroe did not merely want to act. I wanted to choose my stories. I wanted to study. I wanted to understand the art that had been placed in my hands before I had even had the time to comprehend it. It was then that I joined the Actors Studio, the legendary acting laboratory in New York. There, I studied with Lee Strasberg, immersing myself in the method which taught actors to draw upon real emotions from within. For the first time, I was not being shaped by producers, photographers, or directors. I was looking inward, and what I found was not merely talent, it was a profound sensitivity, almost painful, a sensitivity that understood the world through empathy. Perhaps that is why a seemingly small episode revealed something essential about who I was. In Los Angeles, when I was medicated with strong barbiturates, my mind lost the ability to delve within itself and truly bring forth what art demands. That was precisely what I was fighting against, and several people close to me, including journalists, can attest to my resistance to take those medications. I would show them the medicines and say, "Look at what they are doing to me. Now I'm even being made to take injections. They say it's for my liver, but honestly, I do not know." When I left Hollywood, it felt strange and liberating. For the first time, no one was asking me to smile for a camera or to walk in a certain way to appear seductive. Outside Hollywood, they want to know what I felt, and I began to discover that feeling deeply was perhaps the truest thing within me. During that same decade, something happened that few people noticed. There was a singer named Ella Fitzgerald, one of the most extraordinary voices I had ever heard, and I loved listening to music of real quality. Yet despite her immense talent, she still faced closed doors in certain places. At that time, some nightclubs simply would not hire black artists as the main attraction. The Mocambo was one of those famous Hollywood clubs. When I learned of this, I thought perhaps I could help. I telephoned the club's owner and said that if he booked Ella Fitzgerald, I would sit at the front table every single night. I promised to bring photographers. I promised to invite the press. I called friends in Hollywood, asking them to be there with me. I did not do it for attention. I did it because I believed talent should be enough. And it was. Her show was a success. Years later, Ella said that it had changed her career. But to me, it simply felt like the right thing to do. And as expected, these gestures of mine were not well received by powerful men, politicians, and businessmen. The truth is, I had always known what it was like to be underestimated. Perhaps that is why I recognized it when it was happening to someone else. It was also in New York that Arthur Miller returned to my life. I had met him a few years earlier, but it was there that we truly began to talk properly. Arthur was different from the people I usually encountered in Hollywood. He spoke about ideas, books, politics, morality, about what people believe and what they pretend to believe. And to my surprise, he spoke to me as though I were capable of understanding all of it. It may seem like a small thing, but being taken seriously can completely change the way you see yourself. We were married on 29 June 1956. Shortly before the wedding, I converted to Judaism. I did not do it out of obligation. I did it because I wanted to be part of his world. I wanted to belong to something deeper than Hollywood. But at the same time, my career was changing as well. Paula Strasberg, the wife of Lee Strasberg from the Actors Studio, became my acting coach. In 1956, I made a film called Buzz Stop. The character was fragile, insecure, somewhat lost, and I immersed myself in her in order to understand her. When the film was released, some critics said they had finally seen something different in me, something human. I had always wanted them to see that, but life never moves in a straight line. At that time, the United States was going through a difficult period. Many artists and writers were being investigated because of their political ideas. Arthur was called to testify before the House UN-American Activities Committee. They wanted him to name people he knew. He refused. I went to court with him, not as Marilyn Monroe, the film star, but as his wife. Separating the two was simple, at least in my own mind. He was convicted in 1957. Fortunately, the decision was overturned later, in 1958, but that period was heavy for both of us. During the day, there was always someone watching, cameras, reporters, eyes trying to discover something about me before I even knew what I myself was feeling. But at night, when everything fell silent, I could hear my own thoughts. Sometimes I wrote at night because it was the only time when the world seemed to stop looking at me. In fact, speaking of my memories, the night was not the chaos of insomnia, as journalists and producers describe it. I was productive at night. I studied scripts, recorded audio, wrote, read books. During that period, I thought a great deal about Arthur. When we married, I felt I was entering a deeper world, a world of ideas, books, and people who discussed morality, justice, and the fate of society. Arthur always believed that a writer could not turn a blind eye to the suffering of the world. He spoke about workers, about the poor, about the injustices. Many prefer to pretend they did not exist. Arthur spoke of exactly what I thought, what I witnessed, what I tried to fight for in silence, to give dignity to those who were denied. It was not only Arthur and I who thought this way, but also Frank Sinatra and many others. I understood that, perhaps, because before I was Marilyn Monroe, I had been Norma Jean, and Norma Jean knew very well what it felt like to have no one to defend her. We spoke often about civil rights, about equality, about the fact that black artists were frequently pushed away from the most important stages in America. I always found it strange that the faint human dignity could be seen as something dangerous, but apparently it was. When Arthur was called before the committee, something changed around us. Suddenly, our lives became political. Some powerful people had already sent me messages before. Subtle comments, warnings, delivered politely, yet carrying a silent threat. They said it might be better if I were careful with certain causes. They said it might be better if I stopped involving myself so much with issues related to civil rights, black artists, the poor, and gay people. These phrases were always accompanied by smiles that never reached the eyes. When Art began to be investigated, I realized that his trial would be more than a political process. It would also be a spectacle, and somehow my name ended up on that stage as well. My name appeared in newspapers alongside his. Headlines about Marilyn Monroe and Arthur Miller, as though our marriage were part of a political narrative. I wondered whether, for some men in positions of power, that was convenient. It was easier to turn everything into a drama involving a famous actress, easier to reduce serious issues to a celebrity story, turn the case into a spectacle, could make the public forget the real reason behind that persecution. There were nights when a difficult thought entered my mind. At certain moments in my marriage to Arthur, I found myself wondering whether he was using me as a shield. That thoughts came days before Arthur suggested that we leave the United States and move to another country. My answer came quickly. Absolutely not. I love my country. I will fight for my country, for everyone who was born here or lives here, helping it to grow. I will fight for dignity for all. Arthur replied at once. Don't be silly. You could work anywhere in the world as an actress. I wondered whether my presence at his side made things safer for him in the eyes of public opinion. Perhaps it's unfair to say that. Arthur was always a courageous man. He refused to denounce colleagues, even knowing it could destroy his career. But fear has a strange way of entering one's thoughts, especially when certain things begin to happen around you. At that time, I began to notice men appearing repeatedly in the same places, cars parked for long periods near where we lived, faces I did not recognize, yet which kept reappearing in the streets. At first, I thought it was merely my imagination. Being famous meant that people were always watching, but this felt different. It was a cold, observant gaze, as though they were recording every movement. I began to feel that I was being followed in the streets, in restaurants, in the studios, even near the house where Arthur and I lived. It was frightening. When I told doctors about it, they would say, it is normal given your clinical condition to experience hallucinations. We shall add 2 more medications. I remember perfectly how the doctors warned me that if I spoke about this to anyone, I might begin to receive treatment for schizophrenia. It was so cruel. I was never entirely certain what was truly happening. Perhaps Arthur noticed something as well. Perhaps not. We rarely spoke about it, but that sense of silent surveillance never completely left me during that period, not until the day of my death. There is a part of my story that also needs to be understood. When I decided to open my own production company, Marilyn Monroe Productions, I knew I was crossing a boundary that almost no woman had crossed before in Hollywood. An actor and moreover a woman attempting to control her own career, choose her own projects, produce her own films. This was not welcome to many. I faced the resistance from the very beginning, alongside my friend, the photographer and producer Milton Green, who deeply believed in my talent and my intelligence. We began this journey with courage. We wanted to prove that an artist could have autonomy, could choose her roles, could produce her own stories. But many people did not want that to succeed. During my marriage to Arthur Miller, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, something began to unravel within me. Arthur began to plant doubts. He questioned my partner's intentions, diminished his talent, insinuated that I was being deceived, that I was being used, that I would not be capable of managing a company, that I did not understand business. And when someone you love begins to repeat such things day after day, they begin to take root in your mind. The truth is that Arthur harbored a deep personal jealousy of Milton Green, and that jealousy grew until it became a silent influence, one that ultimately destroyed a partnership built on trust and friendship. At the same time, in Hollywood, there was another force working against us: producers, executives, directors, actors. Many did not accept the idea of an actress taking control of her own career. The atmosphere on set was difficult. Negotiations became complicated. Projects seemed to stall. Doors closed. I remember producers asking me to read scripts and giving me freedom to alter them, and I did. They were successful, yet it could never be said that it was I who had done it. My name could never appear as a writer or screenwriter. At the time, I did not fully understand it, but looking back now, I can see there was a constant movement to ensure that my independence would fail. It was though an invisible script was being written so that none of it would succeed, and little by little my dream of independence was interrupted. Still married to Arthur Miller, I distanced myself from Milton Green. I stopped speaking to my friend, my partner, the man who had believed in me when few others did. I carried a great deal of pain within me because of that, not towards Milton, towards myself, because for a long time I believed that perhaps I had been weak, that perhaps I had allowed other voices to speak louder than my own intuition. I thought that perhaps I had been convinced that I was not capable or that he was harming me. But Milton was not. He was fighting for an opportunity in the world just as I was fighting for mine. With time and with greater clarity, I came to understand how I had been guided, manipulated, and pressured into abandoning that project. And what few people know is that reactivating my production company was once again part of my plans, just days before my death. Perhaps one of my greatest flaws was my honesty. I spoke openly about what I intended to do. I told people when something needed to change. I said when someone would no longer be part of my team. I spoke of reorganizing everything. New lawyers, new doctors, a new structure, a new phase. I spoke, and perhaps by speaking too much, I gave the others time to organize themselves against me before I could act. But that was also my nature. I always preferred the truth. It was then that I began to understand something about the world. The most dangerous people are not always those who shout. Sometimes they are the ones who observe in silence. Arthur believed that the truth would always find a way to survive. I wish I had believed that with the same conviction, but at that time I also began to realize something else. The truth can be deeply uncomfortable for powerful people, especially when it concerns justice, equality, and human rights. And perhaps that is why artists, writers, and even actresses sometimes became targets, not because they were dangerous, but because they reminded the world that something was wrong. They invited the public to think, to question, and powerful people rarely like to be reminded of that. While all of this was happening in the public world, there were other things happening in my life that almost no one saw. I always wanted to have children, but I faced several health issues, endometriosis, miscarriages. These losses are difficult to explain. Some pains are too silent to fit into interviews or headlines. Even so, I continued working, but there was a thought that stayed with me for years. Were the losses of my babies truly spontaneous? In 1957, I acted in The Prince and the Showgirl with Laurence Olivier. It was an important project because it was part of my own production company, but the film was complicated. There were differences in style, in temperament, and to be honest, I was also struggling with a great deal of anxiety. Sleeping without medication became difficult. I began to depend more and more on medicines prescribed by doctors. Even so, I continued trying to do the best work I could. In 1958, I returned to Hollywood to film a comedy called Some Like It Hot, directed by Billy Wilder. On set, I was still battling insecurities, delays, and the fear of not being good enough. Strangely, I saw colleagues using drugs openly on set. Yet for everyone, the problem was Marilyn Monroe. I have read many accounts, even today, saying Marilyn Monroe endured night after night without sleep. So, let us clarify this once and for all. I did suffer from insomnia like thousands of people, but I had extremely strong medications prescribed by 3 different doctors. When I took them, I slept deeply, so deeply that my body would not wake as it should when it should. The medications left me extremely drowsy in the morning, almost drugged, with slurred speech and difficulty communicating. Then came other medicines to wake me up. It seemed insane to me, a lack of respect, a loss of control on the part of the doctors and those around me. That was the real reason for my delays in arriving at the studios, and also why I often chose not to take the medication, resulting in sleepless nights or falling asleep only an hour before I had to wake, leaving me exhausted for days. So, I became increasingly dependent on prescribed medication to cope with insomnia, stress, and pain. Even so, I kept trying to work, trying to love, making plans, and there was something genuine within me. I made it clear when I did not like something. It was already clear to those who worked with me that I was not happy with the services being provided, and they were on the verge of being dismissed, as I had dismissed and replaced many others before. I was fighting to exist within a life that often seemed too vast to fit inside a single person. But when the camera began to roll, something different happened. The character Sugar Cane was light, dreamy, a little lost, and full of hope. Perhaps I was placing parts of myself into her. Today, many consider that film a classic, but at the time, I was not thinking about film history. I was simply trying to carry on. Between 1955 and 1958, I tried to change my life. I tried to be more than an image. I tried to learn, to love, to grow, to belong. Perhaps the world never fully understood who I was. But during those years in New York, far from the noise of Hollywood, I came closer to the truth about myself than at any other time in my life. And sometimes that is enough. When I was a girl, all I wanted was something simple, a safe place, a home, someone to tell me that I belonged somewhere in the world. But at some point, life carried me far away from that girl called Norma Jean. Between 1955 and the years that followed, I felt as though I were passing through many versions of myself. That was the Marilyn who confronted the studios to be respected. The Marilyn who went to New York trying to learn to be a real actress. The Marilyn who fell in love with a man who believed that art must have conscience. And there was also the Marilyn who began to see how harsh the world could be towards those who dared to think. I met people who spoke about justice, rights, equality, men and women who believed America could be better than it was. And I want to believe that too. Perhaps because deep down, I had never forgotten what it felt like to be invisible. But at the same time, I began to note something that frightened me. The closer you come to the truth, the more some people seem to want to silence it. There were days when I felt they were not only watching Marilyn Monroe, the actress, they were watching the woman, watching the people I spoke to, watching the ideas I listened to. Sometimes I wondered when exactly my life had ceased to be entirely my own. Whether it was when my face first appeared on a cinema screen, or when my name began to appear alongside men involved in politics, in causes, and discussions far beyond Hollywood. I did not know. I only knew that somewhere along that path, I began to understand something very important. To be seen by the entire world does not mean to be understood, and to be admired by millions does not mean to be protected. Sometimes, pain does not come only from the loss of love. It comes from the discovery that some people around us were writing a script for us, a script we never chose. I remember clearly the day I opened Arthur's diary. Among various notes, accusations, and slanders, I could never have imagined finding there was something that struck me to the core. He had written that he felt ashamed of me, ashamed of the way I laughed, ashamed of the way I walked, ashamed of the way I spoke to his intellectual friends. those who discussed ideas and books and words I longed to understand and belong to. Reading that devastated me. It felt as though I had been thrown into a refuse bin, discarded without defense, condemned for crimes I had never committed, judged for gestures that were simply mine. I felt the humiliation physically. Every word was a stab, every sentence an accusation I could not answer. It was unjust, cruel, silent, and worst of all, it came from someone I loved, someone from whom I expected understanding and partnership, someone who claimed to defend human rights. On set, that feeling grew. He observed me, assessed me, recorded every hesitation, every smile, every mistake. His presence became a shadow, as though I had to prove at every moment that I deserved to exist there, that I was not merely an image or a fantasy. And now, reading those words, I realized something I did not wish to admit. Arthur was not merely writing about me, he was participating in the creation of a script for my life. A script that reduced me to a character and erased me as a woman. I felt a mixture of sadness, anger, and a deep fear, because that silent condemnation did not remain private. It seemed to whisper to the world, this woman is undisciplined, fragile, flawed. And yet, something within me refused to yield completely. My voice, my feelings, my humanity, those no one could write, record, or condemn. And no matter how much they tried to diminish me, I was still there. I still existed. I still felt. And perhaps resisting was the only way to be truly free. After the end of my marriage to Arthur Miller, I was fragile, yes, but I was also lucid enough to believe that I could still trust certain people. It was then that I was encouraged to update my will. I wanted young people without means to have the same opportunity I had at the Actors Studio. Art had opened my mind, expanded my world, made me believe I could be more than what Hollywood expected of me. I spoke about this with Lee Strasberg and Paula Strasberg. At the time, it felt like the right decision. I expressed my wish for underprivileged children to receive psychological and medical care. I spoke of how much I wanted my mother to be well cared for in a quality clinic with dignity, that my sister should not be left without support either. The will could be changed at any time, beneficiaries added or removed. But a month later, Dr. Marianne Grace and friends in New York, including some from the Actors Studio, told me that I need to rest. They said I was tired, stressed, devastated, that New York would be a safe place, a calm and high-standard clinic where I could recover my strength. I believed them. What I found was something else. Upon entering the Pain Whitney Psychiatric Clinic, I was quite literally thrown into a room that resembled more a cell for psychiatric patients than a place of care. Locked doors, a padded room, screams. I cried, I pleaded, I shouted, and in response, I was placed in a straitjacket, medicated with injections, silence, and the terrible feeling that everyone knew where I was being taken except me. For days, I remained there, unable to understand how a woman who had fought so hard to control her own life could be reduced to a diagnosis she herself did not recognize. And when they finally gave me access to a telephone, I did not call Hollywood. I did not call the Strasbergs. I did not call doctors. I did not call the actor's studio. I called Joe DiMaggio because deep down I knew Joe was the only person who still saw the woman behind the myth. The only one who had no interest in writing a character called Marilyn Monroe. In those years, women who dared to decide too much, speak too much, or dream too much were easily labeled unstable. A single diagnosis was enough, and everything else could be decided for them. But within me, something remains very clear. I needed to rebuild my life, change the people around me, reconsider decisions I had made in moments of pain. And yes, I needed to reconsider my will. Only now, there was an invisible obstacle. I was led to believe that once your name is entered into the records of psychiatric clinic, the world begins to doubt your very ability to decide your own life. At that moment, I did not yet know how far this story would go. But one thing I knew with absolutely certainty, my story had not yet finished being written. Sometimes I think that life is made of encounters that continue to echo long after they have ended. My marriage to Arthur did not bring me only a husband. It also brought people who came to inhabit my heart in a quiet and genuine way. His parents, Augusta Miller and Isidore Miller, became for me sources of affection, warmth, and humanity. Amid the turbulence of public life, they represented something simple and precious, the feeling of belonging. When Augusta Miller passed away, I truly felt her absence, and I felt how much Isidore Miller needed support. Even after my separation from Arthur, I maintained the same affection and respect for him. Perhaps because certain bonds do not dissolve with time, they merely change form, like rivers that continue their course along unseen paths. With Arthur, however, I never again had, nor wished to have, any contact. He became part of a silent list of people who had deeply hurt me, wounds that were physical, psychological, emotional, and even financial. Over the course of my life, I learned something essential for survival. It did not matter who the person was or what type they held. When someone crossed certain boundaries, I turned the page and removed that presence from my life. Today, however, I think of existence as a great circle. I hold an intimate certainty, not necessarily explainable, but deeply felt, that the soul continues its journey. If reincarnation exists, if consciousness truly finds a new path in the universe, then I know that Arthur is somewhere, living, learning, moving forward. And to him, I would like to send something very simple: my love and my forgiveness. I also send my apologies, not dramatic apologies, but human ones, because I was human, because I made mistakes, because sometimes we love without fully knowing how to care for what we feel. To the descendants of Arthur Miller, I also send my respect and my tenderness. The story that existed between us belongs to the past, but respect remains in the present. I'm not here to judge anyone, nor to reopen old wounds. I am simply telling my story. Everyone who was part of it is forgiven. There is no desire within me to carry negative energies, nor any wish to nurture resentment. What remains is something else: forgiveness, memory, learning, and justice. Because in the end, perhaps that is what life truly leaves us. Not grievances, but lessons. Not conflicts, but the possibility to understand, to forgive, and to move forward with a heart broader than before.